The hospitality industry is booming. There has not been a better time to prepare yourself for a major role in this exciting industry. Hotels are developed every year and there are now an amazing variety of employment opportunities. This course on Academy Europe will introduce you to all the aspects of hotel management from food and beverage, front office and sales while providing you with the knowledge and skills needed to find a top position, developing your self-confidence and management skills. If you enjoy working with people in a very busy environment, then hotel work may offer the opportunities you have been looking for. Contents: franchising, types of competition, industry output and resources, what IT means to be in the hotel industry. A fundamental point must be made clear before commencing this chapter. That is the distinction between establishments, firms and the industry. An establishment is a single unit, such as a single restaurant, a single fast food outlet, or a single hotel, either operating as a business entity in its own right, or as part of a group. A firm is an establishment or a group of establishments under common ownership, which may operate in more than one sector of the industry, or in more than one industry. The industry, in this case the hotel and catering industry, is the collection of establishments and firms which offer for sale food, drink and accommodation, away from home. Two apparently conflicting characteristics can be identified in the hotel and catering industry. 1. The predominance of the small unit. 2. The growth of firms. 1. The predominance of the small unit. Most units, especially in the restaurant and hotel sections of industry, are small. The average size hotel has less than 20 rooms. The average restaurant has one less than 20 covers. The main reason for this lies in the extent of the market, the nature of the product and the difficulties of exploiting technical economics of scale. The physical size of the market for hotels and restaurants is severely limited. Customers are not prepared to travel long distance to have a meal. At lunchtime this limit may be as low as 100 meters. Thus it is true to say that restaurants serve a local market, and it is the size of that market and the extent of the competition which will determine the size of a given restaurant. The same can be said for hotels. There are only so many people who demand accommodation in a given area, and it is the number of people and the extent of the accommodation which determine the optimum number of bed spaces. There is clearly no point in building a 200-bed space hotel, if the maximum demand for most of the year is only 100 bed spaces. The nature of the product in the hotel and catering industry also determines that most units will be small. The industry does not simply sell food, drink and accommodation. Service is a vital element in that product, and service can be given more readily in small establishments as opposed to large establishments. Larger units have to work much harder to attain the same efficiency and effectiveness of service. Establishments in the industry find it difficult to exploit the technical economies of scale. At this stage it is necessary to give an explanation of technical economies of scale. Economies of scale suggest that as an establishment grows, or increases its output, its average output cannot fall. In other words, the establishment becomes more efficient. Technical economies are those resulting from the use of machinery. Examples from the catering industry would be washing up machines, cleaning equipment, electronic billing machines and computers. All these are found in the hotel and catering industry, but only in the larger establishments. A hotel or restaurant of typically small size would not find it economically viable to use some of these expensive items of equipment, and they would need considerable capital to undergo expansion in order to make this equipment a viable proposition. For these reasons, units which start small tend to remain small. Other reasons for the predominance of the small unit are the extent of competition, the difficulty of raising finance in order to buy businesses, the desire of owners to run and control their own businesses, and the way in which many small hotels develop from private households. 2. The growth of firms. While we have discussed the reasons for a predominance of small units, it must be realized that at the same time it is possible to discern the growth of firms in the catering industry, and it must be explained how this occurs. The first thing to note is that most growth occurs through the multiplication of outlets rather than through the growth of the outlets themselves. It has already been noted that the size of units is limited by the size of the market. The land upon which they stand may be fairly developed, and adjoining property may not be available. Thus, if the owner of a single successful unit wishes to expand, he must do so not by increasing the size of existing units, but by opening up new units in different areas. In this way chains of hotels and restaurants are developed. This also may occur because of takeovers and mergers. Such expansion is called horizontal integration, the growth of firms by the multiplication of similar units at the same level of production. In the hotel and catering industry most of this occurs at the retail level. Firms can also grow by expansion along the line of production. This can be either backwards towards the source of supply or forwards towards the marketplace. Such expansion is known as vertical integration. The former is backward vertical integration and the latter is forward vertical integration. Firms also expand by moving into different markets and selling different products. In other words, they diversify their product. This is called lateral integration. The simplest examples would be a hotel which provides a pub lunch or a bakery which opens a snack bar and a takeaway service. It must now be explained why firms wish to expand. The reasons for growth are many and include the simple desire to make a profit, to become more efficient by exploiting the economies of scale, the need to guarantee outlets for products and supplies of raw materials, and the wish to increase market share. The assumption that all firms attempt to maximize profits lies behind a great deal of economic analysis and, while not universally true, the profit motive lies behind many decisions to expand output. Mention has already been made of the economies of scale. By increasing their size, firms can decrease their average costs because the fixed costs are spread over more units of output. The use of machinery can help firms to achieve greater efficiency through greater output, and these are known as technical economies. Large firms achieve marketing economies, because their marketing costs are spread over many establishments. For instance, a television advertisement campaign can be undertaken by an organization as large as Kentucky Fried Chicken, but it could not be contemplated by the owner of a single hotel or restaurant. Buying economies are achieved by bulk buying. The larger the firm, then the more it can buy in bulk, and also it can claim larger trace discounts. Large firms employ specialist managers and thus exploit managerial economies. Food and beverage managers, reception managers, and personnel managers are examples which may be found in large hotels. The small hotel owner has to carry such functions and many others by himself. Franchising. Franchising combines the advantages of small establishments with the advantages of large-scale production, and it also shows how the vertical and horizontal integration can take place within the same organization. A franchise operation is a financial and business arrangement between two parties, a franchisor and a franchisee. The franchisor is the central part of the organization. He will develop a product, find retail sites for that product, manufacture and distribute the product, and advertise it on a large scale. He will then find people who are willing to put some capital into the organization and run the outlets on strictly standardized lines. These people are known as the franchisees, and they will run a relatively small organization, building up close contacts with their customers and giving a personal service. Thus the franchisor does those things which are best carried out on a large scale, while the franchisees carry out those operations which are best suited to small units. The manufacture and supply of the products to the retail outlets is an example of forward vertical integration. The chain of retail outlets is an example of horizontal integration. The promotion of brand image is an essential feature of such organizations. The product must be presented as a standardized package. Items sold must be of a uniform standard. Menus must contain the same items which might be identically priced. The units themselves have an identical appearance from the outside, therefore, they are easily recognized by potential customers, and they have identical decor and layout inside so that customers feel that they are in familiar surroundings. Even the staff uniforms are identical from unit to unit. The main reasons for the growth in this particular form of organization within this sector are threefold. A. It partly overcomes the problem of lack of capital because contributions are shared between franchisor and the franchisees. B. There have been many technical developments and new products which are nationally acceptable. C. During the past decade many good sites became available because of a recession in other parts of the economy. There is one thing which is not standardized about franchises, that is the franchise financial agreement itself. The first feature co-note is that the franchisee has to pay a joining fee which is, in essence, his contribution to the capital of the organization. In return he gets the right to sell the franchisor's well-known and well-marketed product in a given locality, provided that he buys all of his supplies from the franchisor and sells them in the standardized style. Rent may also be payable by the franchisee, and he may pay slightly more for his supplies than he would in a free market situation. He franchisor may also take a percentage of the sales or a percentage of the profits made by each outlet. However, each agreement is individually drawn up and there is no such thing as a standardized franchise agreement. Types of competition. The types of competition which exist in an industry or a sector of an industry can determine the way in which establishments and firms operate. Thus it is useful to analyze the various types of competition described by economists and to see which type of competition exists in the various sectors of the hotel and catering industry. The best starting point is to describe the type of competition which is known economically as perfect competition. Several conditions must be satisfied for perfect competition to exist. These are: 1. There must be many buyers of the product, none of whose actions affect the price. 2. There must be many sellers of the product, none of whose actions affect the price. 3. There must be a homogeneous product. That is, consumers must not be able to distinguish between products of different suppliers. 4. All producers sell at the same price. 5. There must be no barriers of entry into the industry. 6. There must be perfect knowledge of products and prices. 7. The units of labor must be homogeneous. Only one sector of the industry comes anywhere close to perfect competition, and that is the bed and breakfast market in a very large seaside resort. Thousands of visitors arrive individually and very few tour operators buy in this particular sector. Many small guest houses and private households offer a small number of bed spaces for sale. Little or no difference can be discerned by buyers before they enter the premises, except the distance from the sea. Within each market there is a fairly uniform price. Licenses are not required to offer room space for sale. Prices may be published in town guides, and although sole traders do not have to publish their accounts, they know roughly how their competitors are doing, because of the new car, foreign holidays and redecoration of premises, etc. The level of skill which is required by the staff is such as to make it all roughly the same. The absence of one or more of these conditions suggests that there is an imperfection in the market, imperfect competition. It could also mean that an element of monopoly is creeping into the market, that is monopolistic competition. The two terms mean the same thing and either one can be used. There are various degrees of imperfect competition varying from imperfect competition itself to monopoly. The type depends upon the number of suppliers. A. Many suppliers, imperfect competition. B. Few suppliers, oligopoly. C. 2 suppliers, duopoly. D. 1 supplier, monopoly. The restaurant sector gives a good example of imperfect competition. There are many suppliers, but the prices and products vary, the skill level of the staff varies enormously, and there are capital barriers to entry. Industry output and resources. This section of the book will cover the following topics. 1. The demand for hotel and catering services. 2. The problems of investment in the hotel industry. 3. Manpower characteristics of the hotel and catering industry. 1. The demand for hotel and catering services. This depends upon 4 main factors. The technique of the economist is to look at the relationship of demand to each factor in turn, assuming that the other factors remain constant. While this is an unrealistic assumption, it does enable the economist to build a better composite picture of some complicated relationships, in the long run. The first factor to consider is the price of the product. Generally speaking, the demand for a product is inversely related to its price. In other words, if the price is reduced, the demand expands, and if the price is raised, demand contracts. There are exceptions to this rule. For example, a very expensive hotel room, which is bought because it is the most expensive. A question to ask is, how much will demand change for a given price change? Will there be a relatively large response to a relatively low change in price, or will the response be negligible? Economists use the term elasticity to describe the size of this response of demand to changes in factors which determine the level of demand. In this particular case, it is the responsiveness of demand to changes in price. If demand for a product changes more than proportionately to a given change in price, then the price elasticity of demand is said to be relatively elastic. If the change is less than proportionate, then it is said to be relatively inelastic. Some products respond a great deal to changes in price, others hardly show any response. Holidays, especially chose out of season, are relatively price variable. Alcoholic beverages are relatively price invariable, as the government is quite aware. Note how frequently the excise duty rises in small amounts. The second factor which determines the demand for a given product is the price of other products. Clearly, these other products must be related in some way with the product under consideration. For example, changes in the price of office equipment will have no effect on the demand for eating out. The concern here is about substitutes and complements. For example, holidays in your own country are substitutes for holidays overseas. Beef is a substitute for lamb. Many other examples can be listed. The demand for holidays at home is clearly affected by the price of holidays overseas in a direct way. If the price of holidays overseas rises, then the demand for holidays at home will also increase, and vice versa. Continuing the holiday example, the demand for accommodation and travel are complementary to one another. An increase in the price of one will result in a contraction of demand for the other. The third factor which determines the demand for a given product is the level of real incomes. Real incomes are the goods and services which consumers can buy with their money incomes. This concept is used to avoid complicated arguments about the value of money incomes as a result of inflation. Always use the term real income in this situation. There is a direct relationship between the demand for a product and the level of real incomes. In other words, as real incomes rise, so do the demand for goods and service. If real incomes fall, then the demand for goods and services will fall. The responsiveness of demand to changes in income is known as income elasticity of demand. Essentials will change little to changes in income, but luxury items are likely to be relatively elastic to changes in income. Finally, changes in tastes and fashion will affect the demand for goods and services. This is no more complicated than saying that certain products become popular and later demand for them increases. Fashion in clothes is probably the best example, but changes in the popularity of holiday destinations, styles of eating and food and drink products also provide good illustrations of the fact that the market is susceptible to many changes in tastes and fashion. The successful operator is the one who can anticipate these changes and respond in the minimum of time. These four factors in aggregate determine the demand for any given product. However, there are many other factors which, in turn, determine prices, incomes and fashion. A list will suffice to give some idea of the complications which are involved. A. The size of the population. B. The age distribution of the population. C. The sex distribution of the population. D. The distribution of income. E. The degree of urbanization. F. The level of terminal education. G. The availability of raw materials. H. The level of international tourism. I. The state of technology. J. The socio-political structure. K. Tax structures. There are four main products in the accommodation sector. A. Domestic holidays. B. Domestic business. C. Overseas holidays. D. Overseas business. All four face uncertain futures. Real incomes have risen very slowly, if at all, since 1979, industry has faced recession, and public services have faced cutbacks. However, recent decreases in the value of currencies in the poorer countries have made those locations a relatively cheap tourist destination. The demand for eating out is subject to many regional variations. Areas of high unemployment do not respond to eating out as well as the more prosperous areas of the country. The fast food sector is becoming more popular than the traditional restaurant. 2. The problems of investment in the hotel and catering industry. It is vital at the outset of this topic to get the definition of investment absolutely clear. It is one of those words which the economist uses in a different manner to the generally held meanings. The normal understanding of the term is putting money somewhere safe in order to earn interest. This act of non-spending the economist refers to as saving. Investment is the purchase of fixed assets. It is a very simple definition, but it must be. The assets which are bought by operators in the hotel and catering industry are land, buildings and interior assets, and these take up to 90% of the employed capital. This has important implications for the type of funds which are required, which will be mostly long-term, for land and buildings, and medium-term, for interior assets. Only 10% of the capital employed is used to finance working capital, the day-to-day expenditure. There are two main sources of funds which are used for investment purposes. A. Internal, which arises from the various forms of business ownership. B. External, borrowing money from sources which are outside of the particular business entity. The main types of business ownership are A. Sole traders. B. Partnerships. C. Private companies. D. Closed corporations. E. Public companies. F. Public authority business undertakings. G. Cooperatives. To describe the types of business, it is necessary to identify the following characteristics. A. Ownership. B. Control. C. The source of capital. D. The share of profits. E. The extent of liability. The sole trader owns and controls his own business. He raises capital from private savings and profits which are plowed back into the business. He retains all of his profits and he has unlimited liability. Partnerships can have anything from 2 to 20 members. They share ownership, control and profits. As each partner makes a contribution to capital, it is possible to raise capital easier than can a sole trader. In most cases, liability is unlimited. The conduct of a partnership is usually governed by a partnership agreement which states how much capital each partner has contributed, the interest to which he is entitled on capital employed, the salary to be paid to each partner, and the share of the profit which each partner is to receive. Companies are owned by their shareholders. Control is in the hands of a board of directors who are elected by the shareholders on the basis of 1 share, 1 vote. Capital is raised by the issue of shares, evidence of ownership, and by the issue of debentures, loans secured against fixed assets. The total face value of the latter can be subsequently bought and sold on the stock exchange. The liability of the shareholders is limited to the extent of their shareholding. Public authority business undertakings are owned by central or local government who also has ultimate control over them, although day-to-day control is in the hands of appointees. Examples are catering in provincial hospitals, the armed services and the prison service. Capital is provided by the government. External sources of funds are used when businesses cannot raise sufficient capital by themselves. The following list is not exhaustive, but it is intended to give an idea of where operators can look for investment funds. A. Local banks. B. Building societies. C. Insurance and pension companies. D. Trade creditors. E. Tourist boards. Pound. The Small Business Development Corporation. G. The government. H. The Industrial Development Corporation. The nature of the fixed assets which need to be purchased determines the nature of the funds needed to finance the assets. Land and buildings require long-term finance, 20 to 30 years. Because lenders are reluctant to give up their liquidity for that length of time, borrowing is both difficult to obtain and expensive to finance. In other words, it attracts the highest rates of interest, thereby adding to the catering firm's already high proportion of fixed costs. Medium-term finance, 5 to 7 years, which is required for the purchase of equipment, furniture and furnishings, does not attract the same rates of interest. Nevertheless, the very large amounts of these two types of funds which are required by the hotel and catering companies leave the industry with huge problems of finding sufficient investment capital. The shortage is worsened by the characteristics of the hotel's operations, and by the relatively low rates of return on capital employed, which have been experienced by hotel and catering organizations in recent years. Several courses of action are open to operators in order to overcome the problems of capital shortage. These include franchise agreements, sale and leaseback arrangements, and obtaining the use of funds without ownership. It has already been shown how franchise operations spread the capital costs between franchisor and franchisee. While this method of operation does not fully overcome the problem, it does enable would-be operators to partly overcome the capital barriers of entry into the industry. Sale and leaseback arrangements are only available to operators who already own their own property. by selling the land and buildings to those who specialize in property speculation and, at the same time, arranging to lease back the property for a long period of time. Such operators release cash which has been tied up in these fixed assets. Provided that the money is put to good use in redecorating and modernizing the property, sufficient profit should be generated to pay the annual rent and to make a reasonable return on the deal. Although the operator retains the use of the assets, he does lose their ownership, and such a move is usually a last resort which is used by those experiencing acute cash flow problems. It is the use rather than the ownership of assets which is important for profitability, and many ways can be found to achieve this, such as renting, leasing, hiring and hire purchase. Such means should always be considered by firms who are finding it difficult to raise funds for investment purposes. 3. Manpower characteristics of the hotel and catering industry. At this stage the treatment of labor input will be brief, because it will be dealt with in much more detail in the next lesson. At this stage the main characteristics of the labor force, the problem of labor turnover and the question of trade unionism in the catering industry will be considered. Much of the work is of a part-time nature. The daily and weekly peaks of activity so typical of the industry can be met by employing people at busy times only. Even the seasonal pattern of demand is coped with by taking on more employees in the high season, many of whom are students who just happen to be available at that time of the year. Many foreign workers are employed in the hotel and catering industry. They may have learned their catering skills in their countries of origin. Another strong feature of the workforce is the high number of self-employed persons. It is an industry which attracts people who wish to work for themselves, giving them an opportunity to create and take risks. Labor turnover is defined as the number of people leaving an establishment in a year, expressed as a percentage of those who are normally employed. The annual rate in the catering industry is high at about 80%, and this involves the industry in particularly high costs. It is therefore necessary to identify these costs, to identify the causes and to suggest solutions to the problem of labor turnover. The largest single cost and the one most often missed in analysis is the loss of turnover, which is caused by staff shortages. Rooms cannot be sold to potential guests if there is insufficient staff to clean them. Diners cannot be served in restaurants without sufficient waiters and kitchen staff. Many a thirst goes unquenched when there is a shortage of bar staff. The loss of sales is not only felt immediately, but it is also a long-term problem. Guests who are dissatisfied with the poor service, caused by staff shortages, do not return, and they do not recommend the establishment. The process of replacing staff who leave is not immediate, and in addition, it itself incurs the cost of advertising, recruitment, selection, induction and training, which together can become a considerable amount. Some have calculated that the total cost of replacing a worker who leaves can easily roll into thousands. If that is the case, it is clearly important to reduce the rate of labor turnover as quickly and as much as possible. The causes of labor turnover lie in the nature of the workforce and in the conditions of employment. It is very difficult to alter the former. Female workers still need to be employed, but they may leave because of their family commitments. Part-timers and casual workers inevitably move on. Foreign workers will return to their own countries. The unskilled will always see greener grass in the next job. However, it is possible to reduce the level of labor turnover by more careful selection processes. Something can be done about the conditions of employment. Split shifts have always been unpopular with the majority of the workforce, and they are not absolutely vital to the running of any operation in modern conditions. The number of shifts per week can be reduced to advantage in this respect. A watchful eye on the hourly races of pay and an avoidance of Scrooge-like attitudes can result in a more contented workforce without unduly raising costs. Restroom and cloakroom facilities are a requirement of many laws in many countries, therefore why not use their introduction to the firm's advantage, by giving slightly more than the minimum legal requirements. In these ways the conditions of employment can be significantly improved, with the resulting fall in the rate of labor turnover. Membership of the trade union movement is relatively low in the hotel and catering industry, with the notable exceptions of industrial, welfare and transport catering. In these sectors closed shop agreements may even exist. Nevertheless, the vast majority of catering workers do not belong to trade unions. The main reasons are the size structure of the industry, the nature of the labor force and the attitudes of the employers. Units within the catering industry are small and widely scattered, which gives the workers little opportunity to meet informally, let alone formally to organize. They rarely perceive any common interests either because they adopt the owners' rivalries between competing outlets or because they operate in different sectors of the industry. The nature or characteristics of the labor force also goes against trade union membership. Women are not traditionally strong supporters of unions. Part-time and casual workers never see much point in it, and foreign workers are not strong participants, either through ignorance of their activities or because of language difficulties.